March 1973. Studio One, NBC, Burbank. The red light above camera one held steady, and somewhere in the control room, a director counted seconds between breaths. Johnny Carson sat behind the desk that had become, by then, the most important piece of furniture in American entertainment. Not a throne, Carson would have despised the comparison, but something more subtle and more powerful, a position from which careers were elevated or quietly dismantled with nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a perfectly timed silence. The desk was walnut, unremarkable in construction, but it had witnessed March 1973. Studio One, NBC, Burbank. The red light above camera one held steady, and somewhere in the control room, a director counted seconds between breaths. Johnny Carson sat behind the desk that had become, by then, the most important piece of furniture in American entertainment. Not a throne, Carson would have despised the comparison, but something more subtle and more powerful, a position from which careers were elevated or quietly dismantled with nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a perfectly timed silence. The desk was walnut, unremarkable in construction, but it had witnessed more honest confessions, more calculated evasions, and more unguarded moments than any psychiatrist's couch in Los Angeles. It separated Carson from his guests by 3 feet of polished wood, a distance that seemed casual but functioned as a moat. Cross it carelessly, and America would watch you drown. Burt Reynolds understood this. By the early 70s, Reynolds had appeared on The Tonight Show enough times to recognize the architecture of the conversation, the way Carson built bridges toward vulnerability and then waited to see if his guests would cross them. Reynolds had charm, the kind that photographed well and played even better in person, but charm on Carson's show was currency, not armor. The audience loved Reynolds, loved his self-deprecating stories about failed auditions and bad toupees, loved the way he seemed to wink at his own handsomeness as if it were a practical joke he was playing on Hollywood. But Carson didn't traffic in love, he trafficked in trust. And trust required something darker, the willingness to let the mask slip just for a moment while 20 million people watched. The Tonight Show in 1973 was not merely a television program, it was the final word on American celebrity, the space where fame was either validated or exposed as wishful thinking. An appearance could revive a stalling film career, launch a stand-up comedian into permanent visibility, or destroy a politician's carefully constructed persona in 11 minutes. Carson's power was never loud. He didn't shout or grandstand. He simply sat, listened, and decided, with the tilt of his head or the length of a pause, whether you were interesting enough to matter. The audience at home, eating late dinners in living rooms across 5 time zones, trusted his judgment completely. If Carson laughed, you were funny. If he leaned back and folded his hands, you were in trouble. Reynolds had been a guest many times before, always delivering the expected performance. Anecdotes about stunts gone wrong, flirtations with the camera, the easy physicality of someone who understood that television loved movement. But this night was different. Something in the pacing felt off, as if Reynolds had arrived with a story he hadn't quite decided to tell. Carson, sensing this the way a good poker player senses a bluff, let the conversation drift toward women, always fertile ground for Reynolds, whose romantic life had become a subject of perpetual tabloid fascination. The audience leaned in. This was familiar territory, safe. And then Reynolds said Sally Field's name. Not casually, not with the usual wink and nod deflection that celebrities used when discussing relationships they wanted to acknowledge without actually discussing. He said it carefully, the way someone places a fragile object on a table. And the studio audience, trained by years of watching Carson navigate these moments, went quiet. Carson's face did something it rarely did. It stopped moving entirely. No smile, no nod, no performative reaction for the cameras. Just stillness, the kind of stillness that feels like a door closing. What happened next was not dramatic in the way television usually defines drama. There was no argument, no raised voices, no commercial break called in panic. Reynolds kept talking, his voice steady but stripped of its usual bravado, and he told a story about love. Not the Hollywood version, not the kind that ends with violins and sunsets, but the messy, self-aware kind that comes with regret. He talked about Sally Field not as a conquest or a chapter in his biography, but as someone he had failed, not through cruelty or infidelity, but through the smaller, more corrosive sin of not recognizing what he had until it was gone. He spoke about his own fear of commitment, his need to remain the guy who floated above emotional consequence, and how that need had cost him the one relationship that might have made him something more than famous. Carson said almost nothing. He didn't interrupt, didn't punctuate Reynolds' confession with jokes or reaction shots. He let the silence do the work. And in that silence, something rare happened on live television. A man told the truth about himself without the safety net of irony. The audience didn't laugh, they didn't applaud. They watched, the way people watch something they know they shouldn't be seeing but can't look away from. Reynolds wasn't performing anymore, he was confessing, and the desk between him and Carson felt less like a boundary and more like a confessional screen. The moment lasted perhaps 2 minutes, though time on live television bends strangely when something unrehearsed is happening. Producers in the control booth exchanged glances, uncertain whether to cut away or let it play out. Carson made the decision for them by doing nothing, by refusing to rescue Reynolds from his own honesty. This was the edge that made Carson different from every other host. He understood that discomfort, when allowed to breathe, could be more compelling than comfort. The Tonight Show was not a place where people came to feel safe. It was a place where they came to be seen, and being seen meant accepting that the mask might not survive the lights. When Reynolds finally stopped talking, Carson waited 3 full seconds, an eternity on television, before speaking. He didn't offer platitudes or steer the conversation towards safer ground. He simply said something quiet, something the microphones barely caught, and Reynolds nodded. The commercial break came, and when the show returned, they were talking about something else, something light and forgettable. But the moment had already been sealed into the collective memory of everyone watching. It wasn't the revelation itself that mattered. Hollywood romances ended all the time, and Reynolds' relationship with Sally Field was already public knowledge. What mattered was the tone, the admission of failure from a man whose entire public identity was built on effortless success. In the days that followed, Reynolds' publicist received calls from reporters wanting to know more, wanting quotes and confirmations and expansions of what had been said. Reynolds, uncharacteristically, said nothing further. The story didn't need expanding. It had been told in full, live, in front of an audience that understood they had witnessed something Carson rarely allowed, the collapse of pretense. Not theatrically, not for sympathy or publicity, but because Reynolds had made the mistake of forgetting where he was. He had forgotten that the desk was not a barrier, but a spotlight, and that Carson's silence was not neutrality, but judgment. Johnny Carson never discussed the moment in interviews. He didn't need to. His power on The Tonight Show was never about dominating the conversation, but about creating the space where truth became inevitable. Guests arrived thinking they could control the narrative, that they could deploy their rehearsed anecdotes and exit with their images intact. Carson let them believe this, and then, with nothing more than patience and a willingness to let silence become unbearable, he gave them enough rope to either hang themselves or reveal something worth remembering. Reynolds had chosen the latter, perhaps without meaning to. The desk remained. Night after night, year after year, it sat under the lights while America's most famous and most desperate came to sit across from the man who decided what counted as real. Carson retired in 1992, and the desk was retired with him, but its legacy persists in every late-night set that followed. The distance between host and guest, the implicit understanding that charm is not enough, that humor is a defense mechanism, and that television, live television, is most powerful when it stops being entertainment and becomes something closer to witnessing. Burt Reynolds' career continued. He made more films, appeared on more talk shows, remained famous in the way that certain actors remain famous even when their box office returns diminish. But he never spoke about Sally Field on television again with the same unguarded honesty. Perhaps he learned that honesty in Hollywood is a resource to be rationed. Or perhaps he simply learned what every guest on The Tonight Show eventually learned, that Johnny Carson's desk was not a place for conversation. It was a place for examination, and not everyone survived the diagnosis intact. Sally Field, for her part, went on to win 2 Academy Awards and became one of the most respected actresses of her generation. She rarely discussed Reynolds in interviews, and when she did, it was with the careful diplomacy of someone who had moved beyond a chapter she no longer needed to revisit. But those who watched that night in 1973 remembered the way Reynolds had said her name, carefully, like someone handling glass, and understood that some stories don't need endings to be complete. The Tonight Show continued for 19 more years under Carson's hosting, and in that time, countless guests attempted to replicate Reynolds' moment of vulnerability, to deliver the kind of confession that stops a show in its tracks. Most failed. They mistook vulnerability for weakness, honesty for therapy, and forgot that Carson's genius was not in extracting confessions, but in recognizing when someone was about to confess and simply not stopping them. The desk, always the desk, remained the dividing line between performance and truth, and Carson remained the only host in American television history who understood that the line was meant to be crossed, but only by those willing to accept the consequences. Years later, after Carson had retired and Reynolds' career had entered its final, quieter phase, a reporter asked Reynolds if he regretted the moment. Reynolds thought for a long time before answering, and when he did, he said something that captured both the power and the danger of The Tonight Show in its prime. He said he didn't regret it, but he wished he had been prepared for what it felt like to tell the truth on television, to say something real and then watch it become public property, replayed and analyzed and stripped of the context that made it feel, in the moment, like the right thing to do. Johnny Carson never needed to control his guests because he understood something more fundamental. Control is an illusion, and the best television happens when that illusion fails. The desk was never about separation. It was about focus. It turned every conversation into a test, every laugh into a verdict, and every silence into a mirror. Reynolds looked into that mirror for 2 minutes in 1973 and saw himself clearly. And 20 million Americans saw him too. Carson, as always, simply watched. That was his genius. He didn't need to react because the reaction was already happening everywhere else, in living rooms, in dorm rooms, in late-night diners, in the quiet moment after the television was turned off and people were left alone with what they had just witnessed. The red light above camera 1 blinked off. The audience filed out into the Burbank night. Johnny Carson shuffled his index cards and prepared for the next guest. The desk remained exactly where it had always been. 3 feet of polished walnuts separating honesty from performance. And the show went on. It always went on. That was the point. That was why America trusted Johnny Carson more than it trusted most presidents. He never promised resolution, never pretended that confession led to redemption. He simply made space for people to be seen, and then let them live with what being seen required. Burt Reynolds learned that lesson once, in front of 20 million witnesses, and the lesson stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling and the applause faded, and the night returned to wherever nights go when television is finished with them.